So structuring for success, structuring your organization, your makerspace for success in fundraising. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is starting a project, because even if you win the bid, there's still a whole other section you've got to go through, which is contracting before the money actually arrives. You may even need to do some of the work before the money actually arrives. So I want to talk about starting a project. If you have won a bid, if you have won a tender, if someone tells you you've been successful, celebrate, but not too much. A little bit. It's the beginning of a new process. When they send you the contract or the grant agreement or the letter or whatever it might be, when they send you whatever paperwork they might send you, or you send them something, if it's a tender and they sign your terms, whatever it might be, read their terms of reference, whatever it might be, my wholehearted advice is scan it quickly, read it incredibly quickly. Like, if it's a 70-page contract, read the critical things in 2 minutes, and then reply and acknowledge saying safely received. Just the other day, I had a contract through where the amount was wrong, because this organization was issuing so many of these contracts, they just the copy and paste problem. The amount was wrong. So I immediately hit reply and said, I think you've sent me the wrong one here. The amount's wrong. What that did was basically, rather than them chasing me to sign, I sent it back to them and say, I'll read it once you've corrected it, you know. So you've got to do that back and forth. So the moment it arrives, take a few minutes to quickly read it, make sure it's accurate. If it is, acknowledge it and say, I'm going to read this and get back to you. You know, thank you. This is great. I'm going to read it and get back to you. But scan it quickly in case there's any errors, in case they've sent you the wrong contract, they've got wrong details in there, whatever it might be, just quickly check it. Then read it properly. Once you've got all the corrections made, read it properly and make annotations. And the annotations are not necessarily for you or for them, but it could be for the people who work on the project later. So annotate something to say, oh, we really need to be aware of this. We need to make sure that, you know, the communications person knows about this clause or whatever it might be. So annotate it. If there are things in the contract you don't like, ask why they're there. Query them and then negotiate on them. I had a contract through once that said we needed to give 1 month's notice to the communications team of the fund every single time we mentioned the fund. So if we were posting a tweet from an event, we would have had to, according to the contract, write to the donor 1 month before sending the tweet out, live streaming from the event, to get their approval. Now, we queried it and they were like, yeah, we just want you to make sure that you're not doing anything wrong with our brand. And we're like, well, yeah, we can check that, but the contract says every single tweet has to be checked a month in advance. And they were like, oh, no, we didn't mean that. And then they changed it. Eventually, once you've queried everything and negotiated it, sign it and save it. Do not use your email as a filing system. Save it in a shared folder, in a Dropbox, something that auditors can find. If nobody else ever looks at it, the auditors, the tax man might want to have a look at it. Keep it in a filing system and make sure it's fully signed. Don't just sign one side and then they have to sign the other and you never file the other side. Make sure that all the signatures are filled in and that you keep the final version. Even if it's on some fancy online portal and you know where to find it, in 7 years' time, that portal might not exist. And some finance systems, some tax regimes need you to keep paperwork for 7 years. Don't allow them to rush you into signing the contract. If they send you a 100-page contract and they say, we need this back by tomorrow, you reply saying, no way. No way. You've taken 3 months to prepare this contract. I am not returning it overnight after, if it's a 100-page contract. Don't allow them to rush you. Take your time. What are they going to do? Are they going to do the whole application process again? Absolutely not. In particular, pay particular attention to the payment schedule. You might need to develop a cash flow plan, because in some of these contracts, they might say milestone 1, milestone 2, milestone 3, here's the payment. Or we're going to make quarterly payments, or we're going to pay in arrears minus 10% or something. Develop a cash flow plan. Use what's in the contract to develop a month-by-month budget for the project. Have a look at the reporting requirements. Sometimes they can be very strenuous, sometimes they might not be. It might be a little line that says quarterly report. If it says quarterly report, write to them and say, do you have a template or do you have an example? Because if that quarterly report is 100 pages long, you're going to spend 3 months writing it. But if that quarterly report is 3 PowerPoint slides, try and match those expectations at the contracting stage. Hopefully you'll know that before you applied, but a lot of donors don't work that way. Media, be careful about sort of generic terms like media. So if they say, for any communications or media activity, we need 1 month's approval. Well, what do you mean by media? Because a tweet, you want a month's notice for a tweet? No. Look at the balance of risk in the contract. Let's say the British government cuts the budget for the RISA fund today. Suddenly there's some economic crisis. This happens, by the way. It's happened to me. There's an economic crisis. All the contracts are cancelled, but you've incurred all of this debt that you haven't billed for yet. Who pays? Have a look at if there's anything in the contract about that kind of risk. And the last thing is intellectual property. Please take care of the intellectual property clause. If they say that everything that you do is now the property of the donor or of the client, really judge whether that's okay. And what I would normally do is say, yes, I'm happy to share that intellectual property. I don't want you to have any barriers to using that intellectual property and sharing it with the world, but we'd like it to be on an open license, and we'd like it to be share alike in attribution, so that every time you say that these slides you're looking at today on a Structuring for Success webinar is the intellectual property of the British government, I'd like to be able to say the Internet of Production is recognised as the author. So you can have a think about, and I want it to be openly licensed. So negotiate on those things. In particular, look at those, because these are oddly the areas where the most amount of negotiation can happen, but also you can get into a real pickle if you don't check them properly. Take good care on who signs. It may not be the project manager. It may not be the chair of the board. It will usually be the executive director. But in your organization, just be careful about who signs a document. Because if the wrong person signs it, it might not be worth anything because they have no authority to sign it. So make sure that everyone in your makerspace, in your organization, knows who has the authority to sign documents. Take care on signing dates. So this project starts on this date and whatever, but maybe the contract has come 3 months late. Maybe you need to backdate the contract. Because if there's a clause that says the payments we will only be able to accept expenses incurred from the date of signing, and the contract has arrived 3 months late, then you have just lost all of your first 3 months worth of money. So you need to backdate the contract. So take care on signing dates. And take care on contact details. Don't put personal contact details in, in the writer contract, andrew.lamb@internetproduction.org, my email address. We shouldn't do that. We should have info at as well, because what if I get hit by a bus? So take care on contact details. When you're starting a project, you might get a lot of policies from the donor or the client, depending on how big they are. A client might have, anti-slavery policy or anti-bribery policy or something you might have. A government will have loads of policies that you'll have to agree with: anti-corruption, whistleblowing, child protection, whatever it might be. I'm afraid you're going to have to read them, all of them, carefully. And you are going to have to determine whether you agree with them, whether they are compatible with the policies of your organization. Because if they line up, great. I'm hoping, most of the time you can just adopt them. So certainly for the RISA project, what distributed manufacturing has done as the contract holder is we've adopted all of RISA's and FCDO policies in full. Those are our policies. And that's great. It means we don't have to write our own. But there may be, particularly around finance policies, different ways of doing things. So maybe, a simple one might be they don't allow alcohol and your policy does allow alcohol. Now, if you start hosting events and serving wine, you're paying for that wine yourself. You're not going to be able to bill it to the donor. So you have to look for things like that to make sure it's compatible. I mean, I'm giving you a silly example here. One of the most difficult examples of a policy to agree with for a makerspace is a lot of donors now, particularly government donors, have waste and sustainability policies. So you have to have policies around environmental health, around health and safety. And they may not be able to advise you on what the content of those policies are. We'll try and do our best to share as many of our policies with you, but quite frankly, you've already got them in the contracts that you've signed. And that's what I mean by adopting them, is you might need to pass them along. So how should you, how can you, how must you comply with the policies of your client or your donor? Can you attach the policies that you later issue? So yes, that's exactly what we did in the awards to each of your makerspaces, in every contract we sent out to all of the consultants, Anna Lowe or Chiara or Enrico or whoever, we've attached all the policies of the RISA fund and FCDO. That's, then we know we're covered. Now your organization might have its own policies. As long as they're compatible, it's fine. As you read these policies, you have to think, are your processes and roles in place? So I'm going to give you a silly example, but it was actually quite an important example. One of the policies of one of the organizations that we work with requires that bank details are confirmed verbally over the phone. So if you need me to pay your expenses for the events in Cape Town, it could be that in order to be compliant with that policy, you email me your bank details, and then we have to have a phone call to say, are these actually your bank details? So you have to think, are your processes in place? Now, it's a silly example, but if at some point there's a problem and we didn't follow the policy, we're liable for that money. We might lose that money because we breached the process, we breached the policy. So make sure your policies are in place. And when I say roles, what I'm thinking about is, an obvious one here is safeguarding. So is it obvious for the people you work with, for the people who come into your space, who to report incidents to if there's an incident with one of the staff, if there's an incident with somebody on the team, if there's an incident with the project manager, the project leader, or board member? Do you know who to contact to report the incident, a breach of safeguarding? You need a role, and you need everyone to know who to contact to report it. Otherwise, people might just be scared to report, and safeguarding incidents can go undealt with. So you've got to really think about can you comply with these policies, and there may be a cost of complying. And by the way, low likelihood doesn't mean low impact. So low likelihood that there will be a safeguarding incident because you're not generally working with vulnerable people, perhaps, or whatever it might be, but there's quite a broad definition of safeguarding. Just because there's a low likelihood doesn't mean it's low impact. If there is one bribe paid in a $2 million project, you could lose all $2 million. So be very careful about compliance. And the devil is in the detail. So timesheets, if the timesheets are not filled out correctly, you could potentially lose the money that you're using that timesheet to claim. You could lose that whole month's salary for that person if the timesheet isn't signed, for example. If it needs a wet ink signature on a real piece of paper and you haven't got that, and what if the template is wrong? You've got to check whether the template is compatible with the donors. Look at the representation of the use of the donor logo. So you can't, if you did a whole bunch of printing and you forgot to put the donor's logo on it, they may not cover the cost of that printing. The devil is in the detail. Take a look at the reporting formats and timelines. I gave the example earlier of, well, how big is the report do you expect every quarter? How long do you need to maintain records for? As a general rule, it's 7 years. You need to keep paying for that software subscription for the finance system for 7 years, or you need to be able to get the data out of it in 7 years' time. And you have paper or electronic records. Do you need to keep paper? Some donors really do unbelievably require actual pieces of paper to be signed. Happily, this project is not one of them. Everything can be photographs, everything can be electronically signed. And in a consortia, who signs the contract? Be really clear about that. Do you need to get agreement from all of the different partners before you sign it? And then when does you might need to pass a document around and you have to sign it at a certain time and pass it on to the next person. So, think about when you're working in consortia, there's a much more involved process of starting a project. Once you've signed the thing, then you can celebrate. You can celebrate more, and you can celebrate with other people. Just getting the email saying you've been successful, you can have a bit of a celebration, as I said at the start. But once you've signed it, then you can celebrate with other people. You still have to wait for the money to arrive. But I think at that point, you have a way of holding the client or the donor to account to actually get the money.